Good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the February beginner's fly tying session and give you a little bit of background before we get started. We're going to be tying today in this program a fly called a dirty bird, and we're not quite sure where it got that name. We know who named it, but we're not sure what he named it after. So before I get into a little bit of that history, I want to tell you why we selected the dirty bird for our February program. The primary reason is that to honor Bob Abraham, who recently passed away, one of the founders of our club. And so I want to pay tribute to Bob, because he was the one that introduced this fly to probably hundreds of people, including myself and some of the other current members of Potomac Valley. And the second reason is to bring into play some new materials that you perhaps have not used before that are used in the construction of this relatively simple pattern, but nonetheless has made it very effective. So to give you a little bit of history then, the dirty bird pattern originated in probably the 1950s, and it was tied first by a gentleman named Truman Doyle. And Truman published an article in the Maryland Conservationist, and I'm going to hold up this particular article. So it was published in the 1950s. And Truman Doyle was from Boonesboro, Maryland, and quite most of us know where Boonesboro is. And nonetheless, he even fished it on Beaver Creek. And that's where the story began. Because it was on one of those days when Truman was fishing larger flies or perhaps even bait. He was not able to catch any recently stocked trout. And so, in desperation, he reached into his fly box and he pulled out this pattern, which he had originally intended to tie to imitate a hellgrammite and use it on the Potomac River to fish for bass. And so, during that desperation, Truman put this fly on and began to catch trout. And so in the article, he documents that over a period of several days and several years from 1955 through 1958, approximately 25% of the trout that he caught, and that would be in testing it against a number of other patterns, as many as 20 to 25 other patterns. The dirty bird was the one fly that gave him the most success, and in which case his percent of total catch using the dirty bird averaged about 25%. Now that's really good. I think that you'll accept that. And so it was somewhat later that our Bob Abraham modified the pattern when he was guiding fly fishers on Potomac River, including some very noteworthy fly fishers. And so Bob, when I first met him some years ago, was introducing the dirty bird at many of the fly tying sessions. And when I would ask him to be one of our guest tyers, he'd say, "You want me to tie the dirty bird?" And of course, we always said yes. And then we found out also that when Bob would teach youth at the Brotherhood of the Jungle Cock, Bob would be basically teaching them the dirty bird, because it's a simple pattern, it's a good pattern to start beginners on, and it's a highly effective pattern. So I guess you would say that Bob became the dirty bird specialist. So we're going to tie this pattern pretty much the way Bob tied it. And however, what we will be doing is I'm going to incorporate in at least one of the two versions of the dirty bird. I'm going to incorporate Truman Doyle's approach to it, in which is only a slight modification in the types of materials and its application. Well, let's start to tie this fly. So I've already placed in the vise a 9672 Mustad streamer hook, and that is in a size 8. So along with that, we are going to be using 6-aught thread. I'm going to use brown unithread. And we will have some brown chenille. This particular chenille has a little bit of light and dark color in it to sort of give it a little bit more of intensity. For the claws of this fly, we're going to be using some turkey tail. I'll be cutting a section of that. And then the spikiness of the body will also represent some of the hackle color, so to speak, on this fly is going to be from this black hen feather or saddle hackle. So the first thing I will do is wrap the shank of the hook with thread and begin to go from right behind the eye of the hook back all the way to around the shank, of course, all the way back to the bend of the hook and just stopping about right above the barb of the hook, and I'll clip off that extra piece of thread. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a section of this turkey tail, and I'll probably clip something right about in this particular part right here, because I like the variation that comes in the fibers of the tail at this point. So I'm going to strip some of that out and clip a piece of this off. And this will represent the tail of this fly, or, well, it is the tail. Nonetheless, it probably represents the pinchers on a hellgrammite, pinchers that would be close to the mouth of the hellgrammite. So I hope that you can see I've taken a section about 1 inch long. I have 2 matching pieces, and I'm just going to put those together for the time being. Lay that right up on top so that I have about maybe 1/4 of an inch of that material sticking beyond the bend of the hook. And so I'll clip off some of this extra here, lay that right on top, using the pinch method to secure those 2 pieces of tail fiber right on the top of the hook. Just a little bit of placement right there. And then I'll wrap this, secure that down, make several thread wraps forward, actually using this, the butt end of these tail feathers to sort of lay down a base on the abdomen of the hook, on the shank of the hook. And as you can see, I already have the semblance of 2 tail fibers. Now I'm going to show you how to keep those separated. What I'm going to do is I'll be wrapping the thread back the shank of the hook till I get back to almost exactly the place I tied it in originally. And then I'll make 1 wrap over the far side, that fiber, go underneath, which will pull it out, back 1 wrap in front, and then come underneath the other side of the fibers, and that will separate them, now forming sort of 2 pinchers. I'll hold up a piece of paper so that behind us, so you can see how that represents a 2-part tail, or representing the 2 pinchers of this fly. So we've wrapped that forward. Now the next thing I'm going to do is secure a piece of this saddle hackle. And what I'll do is I'll clip off all but the very beginning of the fuzzy part of this hackle. And I'll be tying it in by the tip. But first of all, I want to flare it. And the flaring is going to help those hackle fibers stand out, representing some of the spikiness of the abdomen of the fly. So we'll lay that up on top after I bring the thread all the way back to that starting place. And I'm going to trim off some of this, the end here, and then just trim a little bit of that along the side. Hope that you can see that up close. I'm laying the feather on in such a manner that when I begin to twist it around, it's going to flare the hackle sort of to the back. So I'm going to lay that flat on top, like so. And begin to wrap this, tie this down. Wrapping this, oops, didn't quite grab a hold of that. There we go. All right, so I'm tying this feather in again by the tip, all the way back to the beginning of the bend of the hook, which is just about where I put in those turkey tail fibers. I then take a section about 2.5 inches long of the chenille, strip off the end, exposing the core of the chenille, which makes it more secure when you're tying it in. It's probably something that people don't take note of, but I always will scrape off a little bit of the chenille off the end, exposing the threads, which gives it a better point of anchor next to the thread and tied in much tighter. And now I can wrap this thread forward, stopping just behind the eye of the hook, and using either my whip finisher or a half-hitch tool. I can secure this thread with one thread wrap right there at that point, and then using my bobbin holder, hold the thread out of the way while I wrap the chenille around the shank of the hook. And of course, if you have a rotary vise, it's very easy to do it in this manner. However, if you don't have a rotary vise, you can just do it by hand as I'm doing it right now. And once I have that thread up to, that chenille up to the eye of the hook, I can secure it in place with 2 wraps of thread, 2 wraps behind the chenille, 2 wraps in front of the chenille, and then clip off the extra. Now, if you wish to put another half hitch in at this point, there's no harm in doing that. Just holds everything in place while we wrap the hackle around. So I will put the hackle in my hackle pliers and hold it while turning the device, or again, as I did before, I can do it by hand. And as you'll note, we're going to be getting a nice amount of fibers from this hackle protruding out from the body of the fly until we get up here at the front, where we're going to make several wraps with the more, I would call it the fluffy part of the hackle. And then I can secure that with a couple thread wraps. I generally do 2 behind and then 2 in front. And then I can clip off that extra. Notice that I'm holding my hackle out of the way so that I don't hit the thread. And then I can use my half hitch tool or my whip finisher to make a nice, smooth, and secure head on this fly. So I'm trimming a little bit of this extra off of the head, and so we have that secured. Now, you might want to put a drop of head cement on there. I can show you that I'm doing that. Just a touch of that. Just make that nice solid head on that fly. And now what I'm going to do is trim it in such a way that I'm going to get rid of some of this fluffiness that's towards the rear of the fly, while leaving a little bit of more bushiness around the collar of the fly. So in the original pattern, this is the way that the fly would have been finished off. However, Mr. Abraham would trim the whole fly, such as I'm showing in this particular pattern right here. I hope that you can see that. The difference is that he does not have that wing or that extra hackle around the collar as in Mr. Doyle's case, which he does. So the way I'm going to trim this is to get rid of much of this in the back of the abdomen. First I'll trim it away on the bottom. Trim away some at the top. And then the sides. Again, one of the advantages of having a rotary vise is that you can trim away things much easier if you can see them sort of in the background rather than trying to just cut away at a solitary fly pattern. Okay, just about have the product finished here, and I hope that you can see it from the silhouetting that I'm doing by rotating the vise. And so there we have a finished Dirty Bird. Now, before we end this session, I'd like to talk to you just for a few minutes about how I would normally fish this. You notice that we did not put any weight on the shank of the fly. Now, Mr. Abraham, of course, being a guide on the river, did at times put down some lead wrap underneath his fly to help it sink, particularly in the somewhat stronger currents. But if you were fishing this in a relatively shallow, slow-moving stream or in a pond or something like that, you might not need that weight, because after all, you want to be imitating the swimming of a dragonfly or damselfly nymph, as this fly is supposed to represent. And so I would normally then not fish this with weight, but I would try to fish it as a dropper off of maybe another slow-moving fly, or maybe if I were to weight it, I would do that with split shot, maybe 6 inches or so in front of the fly. But whatever way that you fish it, I think that you'll find that this is a very attractive type of fly to give it a try this year. Fishing not only for trout, but also fishing for smallmouth bass and perhaps some larger panfish, crappie, bluegills, something like that. So I hope that you've learned something today about not only about the history of this fly, but also about how it can be tied. So that'll be just about everything for today, and tight lines and happy tying.